In this video, we're diving into the key events from the last few Wolf hours. Things have gotten pretty intense, the energy ceasefire has ended, and the Russians have ramped up their activities. Big time, just last night, between February 1st and 2nd, 2026. They launched a whopping 172 drones to attack Ukraine. It's wild out there. Russians weren't just targeting Ukraine's logistics or military stuff. They were also hitting critical energy infrastructure. If you look at this night compared to previous ones, the difference is huge. For instance, between January 31st and February 2nd, they launched only 90 drones, almost half as many. And from the night of January 30th to the 31st, they used 85 drones. So, as you can see, the intensity of their attacks on energy resources has changed quite a bit. The Russians used half as many drones last night compared to before, which suggests they're gearing up for something big. We're talking about another major attack on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. They've already zeroed in on Kyiv and the surrounding areas as key targets for the strike planned. Between February 2nd and 3rd, according to monitoring sources, reports show the Russian army is moving troops around, so things are definitely heating up. Strategic aircraft are moving between airfields, gearing up for a huge missile drone strike. Sources suggest that between February 2nd and 4th, 2026, Russia might launch a massive attack across Ukraine, targeting the energy infrastructure of city Kyiv. Just a reminder, according to Zelensky, Ukraine is actively preparing for this threat. Russia and the US are set to meet again in the Emirates on Wednesday and Thursday. Just like last time, Zelensky mentioned that the Russians are likely to attack Ukraine a day or two before this meeting. This could really ramp up the pressure on Zelensky to bend to Russia's demands. Plus, we're starting to see some interesting articles popping up about this situation. Western media. A peace agreement needs to be signed because Ukraine is exhausted, says head of the Nikolai region. So this is not somebody outside Ukraine. We are talking about this region in the southern part of Ukraine. This is the Nikolai region, and the head of this region stated that it's time to make a deal. It's time to make a deal with Russians, and it's time to make a deal with Russians, and we are not talking about the borders of 1991. First of all, the head of this region is trying to tell us that it is important to have security guarantees and to finish the war. So this is the situation. We see that the situation is critical, at least it's critical for Zelensky and his plans to probably continue the war until of the borders of 1991. Another important thing is for the current status and current situation with energy infrastructure Ukraine, there are still lots of power stations that operates. For example, here we can see the satellite picture of the Abushinska power plant. As you can see, the power plant is working, is operating. This is the situation in the city of Lvovo. The power stations of the city of Lv is operating. This is the satellite picture of the Kharkiv power station, and this power station is also operating. As for the power station 3 Crane, according to information we have, just one of them was destroyed. And we're talking about the power station of the city of Kyiv number 6. The source is saying that this power station will not be able to restore even after the end of the war. Another important thing, the Russians during the previous 24 hours, as we discussed, launched around 172 drones, and the source are saying that the Russians were attacking significantly the city of Kharkiv. This is one of the most important cities when talking about the logistic in the northern part of Ukraine, because there are railways that go in the direction of the most northeastern parts of Ukraine and in the direction of the Sumy. Should the Russians attack this stage, you're most likely with a purpose to destroy the Ukraine's logistic and also allow the Ukrainians to redeploy additional forces to the line of combat contact. And you know that during the previous 24 hours, we received changes in this area. I would like to remind you that since the beginning of January, we have received lots of updates that the Russians began advancing in the most northeastern part of this region. And during the previous 12 hours, additional sources confirmed that the Russians indeed managed to improve their positions and to capture additional forest and additional positions on the Ukrainian side of the border. So these are the changes on the ground between the 31st of January and the 2nd of February. The Russians are keeping advancing, and as you can see, this area is located right along the railways that go from the city of Kyiv through the settlement of Kanatop in the northeastern direction. So most likely the Koreans were trying to redeploy additional forces with the purpose to stabilize the situation along road by. The Russians attacked the train. Another important attack took place in the area of the Shi by the name of Pavlograd during the previous night. Pro-Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians attacked the settlements of Tivka and targets in Vasilka Petrov, and the source are saying that the Russians attacked the TNFKA coal mine. So the Ukrainians still produce coal for the power station purposes, and the Russians decided to attack the coal mine with the purpose to collapse, to destroy the production of this resource, and which will obviously lead to the situation when the Ukrainian power station will not receive additional resources for generation of power and electricity. So this mine was attacked. It's very difficult to understand whether the Russians managed to deal critical damage or not. But it was just the first night of attack, which means that Russians will continue. Now, let's return back and let's continue with the Sum direction. During the previous 12 hours, very huge and interesting changes were recorded. And first, let's talk about the southeastern direction of the Sum. During the previous 12 hours, additional changes on the ground were recorded. Pro-Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians answered the settlement of Pukovka, and based on this report, pro-Ukrainian sources adjusted the map. They expanded a gray zone to the west of the settlement of Katalovka from the Russian side. So very interesting. This is a very interesting direction, and as you can see, the pro-Ukrainian sources added a very huge gray zone, and this gray zone covers more than 50% of the settlement of Pukovka, which means that there are very heavy clashes, and the Russians are trying to dig in deeper. So during the January of 2026, the Russians were advancing in the area of other villages of Gravka and Riaz. We discussed the situation as well, and now we see that there are like two roads of attacks, and both roads of attacks are moving in one direction. And we are talking about the settlement of Napolea. It seems that the Russians are about to increase other attempts, or intensify their attempts to establish complete control over the settlement of Kash Napolea, and to begin the preparation of another foothold to attack the city of Sumy, but this time from the south and from the southeast. So this is a very dangerous situation for the armored force to Ukraine. Let's wait and see what is going to be next. But this might be a very dangerous once again for Ukrainians. As for the Hark direction, during the previous 12 hours, additional changes were recorded. I would like to remind you that just yesterday pro-Russian sources published this article. The Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation and the Group of Forces North reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians established complete control over the settlement by the name of Zaluna. So based on this report, yesterday we adjusted the maps. They received additional changes. According to new updates, the Russians continue advancing in the area of the Volhyns along the river of Sask in the southern direction, and the Russians improved their positions around the villages of Simonovka and Grava. So these are the changes on the ground between the dates. So it seems that in coming days or even hours, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm Russian control over the settlement of Grak. And furthermore, according to natural mappers, the Russians during the previous days improved their position significantly in the area of the villages of Alchansky, Hutra, Pakayalana, and Zaina. As you can see, the Russians are about to establish complete control over this huge forage forest, which is located along the border. So the Russians are keeping advancing in the northeastern direction with the purpose to probably create a very powerful buffer zone along the border in the most northeastern part of the Hark region. So we are talking about this red line, and then from these positions, Russians most likely will continue offensive operation further deep in the site of the Kharkiv region. As for the equipment's direction, during the previous 12 hours, additional changes were provided by neutral members. So it's still the situation here still remains very difficult to understand what is the exact status of the city of Kupins, because almost every single mapper shows his own picture of the city of Kinsk and the territory is around. So as of now, we are waiting for additional updates, but we have new trend, we have new probably direction. I'm trying to tell you that when talking about the previous months, most of the sources were saying that the Ukrainians launched a counteroffensive operation that forced the Russians to fall back. Now we have a different situation. Now most of the sources are trying to tell us that the Russians launched their offensive operation with the purpose to establish complete control over the city of Kinskin, over the eastern bank of the Raskal, and now everything is about this, how the Russians counterattack Ukrainians, and how Ukrainians are retreating from this area. So which means that now we will start receiving more and more updates. But this time updates about additional control in Russian favor. As for the SL direction, during the previous 12 hours, we received a very important update. According to information we have, the armed force of the Russian Federation managed to establish complete control over strongholds to the south of the settlement of Zakitna. This is a very important piece of news because this is let's say territory, the territory between the settlement of Zakitna and the settlement of Kvaluka. We're talking about these hills is the most valuable positions through the entire direction. And who controls these hills probably controls the entire situation, almost until the cities of Nikol Alexandrika. So based on this report that was published by a nodal mapper, the arm for Russian Federation managed to establish complete control over these two strongholds. And the Russians answered this elevation and these hills, which means that they will continue and they will keep on advancing further in the southern direction with the purpose establish complete control over the territory. And the most powerful defense layer has been already captured, as you can see, by Russians. They will continue offensive once again. If Ukraine loses control over these hills, most likely they will be forced to fall back from the territory to the south. We are talking about the territory between the villages of Kalyani, and the Ukrainians basically would be forced to fall back further in the western direction, towards the settlement of Alexandrivka and towards the huge forest. They will try to stabilize the situation in this area at least for a while. At the same time, the Russians are keeping advancing along MO3 road, and during the previous 12 hours, we received lots of very interesting updates. Some sources shown just roads of attacks of the armed force of the Russian Federation, and some pro-Russian sources adjusted their map. So according to the latest updates, the armed force of the Russian Federation established complete control over the settlement by the name of Nikifaka. As of now, we are waiting for additional updates. Maybe the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm this, and when it happens, we will adjust the map as we see that the Russians are approaching the settlement of Alexander Kender, getting closer and closer to the settlement, and which means that the battle for Slavin is inevitable in coming months. As for the Constantino direction, during the previous 12 hours, additional changes on the ground were recorded. This is the end of the 1st of February. This is the beginning of the 2nd of February. The Russians, as we can see, established complete control over the residential idiots in the eastern part of the settlement. And this information was confirmed based on the videos that were published by pre-Ukrainian sources. And here we can see how Ukrainians were attacking forces and units of the armored force of the Russian Federation that were moving through this part of the city. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map. Once again, these are the changes. And furthermore, this information was confirmed by Nepal mappers. It seems that the Russians are moving further in the northern part of the city of Constantin when talking about, let's say, the river off, and the Russians continue after withdrawing positions of the armed forces of Ukraine in the southern part. So the battle, as you can see, for the city of Constantin continues. The Russians, according to the latest configuration of the map, controlled just 15 or 20% of the settlement and are still very far from the complete control over the settlement itself. Now let's talk about the Debra direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that the settlement of Sahetska was captured by the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Based on the report published by the Ministry of Defense and based on the video published a bit further to the west of the settlement of Sahetska, we have adjusted the map. Here we can see how Ukrainians were attacking sabotage and reconnaissance groups of the armed force. Should the Russian Federation that were moving along the railways? So based on these updates, we have adjusted the map, and we can see that the Russians are about to consolidate their positions along railways between the cities of Radinska and Darnova Danbas and Sahetska. As soon as the Russian Saraboots establish complete control over the territories, you can see most of these territories been considered as a gray zone. So we are waiting for additional updates, and then the map will be adjusted, and this will allow the Russians to begin their major offensive operation towards the settlement of Beleka. Furthermore, today we start reports that Russians began advancing in the direction of the settlement of Beleka from the northeast, from the settlement of DNA, trying to attack the Ukrainians from behind and trying to attack and to cut your 515 roads, that road that connects the city of Belitska with the city of Dropolia. As for the settlement of the Brya, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the settlement. As you can see, lots of buildings were already damaged and significantly destroyed and significantly damaged. And the Russians continue bombing and attacking the territory. This is the last stronghold, the last base, more or less big base of the armed forces of Ukraine in the northwestern and in the western parts of the Donbas region. If Ukraine loses control of the Brya, we won't see a huge settlements in this area in the northwestern direction almost until the distance between the Brya settlement and the Lazova agglomeration is about 70 kilometers. That's quite a stretch without any major cities or towns that Ukrainians could use as strongholds, like Bakovsky or Myrnograd. This means the Russians might be able to move in faster compared to other areas in the region. As for the Zaporozhye direction, there have been some changes in the last 12 hours that are worth noting. The Russians are pushing forward in the western Zaporozhye direction, trying to strengthen their positions around Richna. They're making a move from Novayako toward Varyav in the east, aiming to break through Ukraine's defenses along the railways. This is the second defensive layer. they're facing, with the first being the Gore River. It's a tense situation, and you can feel the pressure mounting. The defense layers are crucial here. The railways form one layer, and the third layer is the area between the settlements. If Ukraine loses control over this third layer near Zaporizhia, it could lead to some really unpredictable outcomes for the city. The Russians could take it way faster than we might think. We're all about keeping track of violence in the world. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and join my Patreon. Have an awesome day.